The moment Karren Prescott, president of the Maple Glen HOA, pointed at my service dog and said, "That mutt is a violation of HOA policy," I knew I was in for a fight. I just didn't expect to enjoy it so much. My name's Damon O'Connell. I'm a 38-year-old ER nurse, and after 12 years in the trauma bay, it takes a lot to rattle me. But Karren? That woman had the kind of shrill confidence only someone with a clipboard and too much time could have. I moved into Maple Glen about 6 months ago. Quiet suburb, decent commute, and the kind of neighborhood where people wave while mowing their lawns. Seemed perfect. I bought a corner lot with a small backyard and a covered porch. My service dog, Ryder, a tall, sleek German shepherd, settled in quick. He's trained for medical alert seizures. I don't advertise it, but I've got a rare neurological thing that hits without warning. Ryder saved my life at least twice. The HOA never bothered me until Karren did. It started with a note on my door. Taped, not even in an envelope. Per HOA regulations, animals over 60 pounds must be approved. Your dog violates this policy. Please remove the animal within 7 days. I stood there in my scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and blood from a double shift, and read it 3 times. Then I laughed. Ryder sat next to me, ears perked. He tilted his head like he was waiting for me to say it wasn't real. But it was. Karren Prescott, self-proclaimed guardian of community values, had declared war on a service dog. I walked to the HOA office the next morning. It's a converted garage on the edge of the community pool with fake plants in every window like they were trying to distract you from the mildew smell. Karren sat at a tiny desk, typing aggressively into a laptop that looked like it hadn't updated since the Bush administration. I knocked once. She didn't look up. "I got your note," I said. Karren finally glanced up, her mouth pulling into a tight line. "You need to remove that dog. We have rules." "He's a service animal," I said. "Covered under federal law." She waved a hand. Federal law doesn't override HOA policy. It was like arguing with a wall that had a name tag. I pulled out Ryder's documentation, certified medical need, training credentials, even the ID tag issued by the Department of Health. Karren didn't even look at it. She just leaned back and said, "We don't allow large animals. And frankly, your dog is intimidating the neighbors." "Name one," I said. She didn't. Just tapped her keyboard like it was Morse code for, "I'm not done making your life hell." I didn't argue. I just left. By that evening, my mailbox had a second letter. This one was an official violation notice, citing me for non-compliance and warning of escalating fines. $50 a day. The next morning, Ryder and I went for a walk like we always do. He wore his vest bright red, clearly labeled service animal. As we passed the Prescott house, Karren stormed out in a robe and slippers. "You're still walking the beast around." "He's working," I said. "You want to explain to a judge how you're interfering with a medical aid?" "I'll see you fined," she snapped. "Or evicted." I didn't respond. I just bent down, gave Ryder a pat, and kept walking. That night, I started documenting everything. Every letter, every interaction. I installed a Ring camera on my porch. I printed out the Fair Housing Act and highlighted the sections on service animals. I also called the State Fair Housing Authority and filed a formal complaint. They didn't hesitate. "A service animal is not a pet," the agent told me. "HOAs are not exempt from federal law. What she's doing is discriminatory and illegal." They launched an investigation immediately. Meanwhile, Karren escalated. She started sending notices for made-up infractions. Untrimmed bushes, they were trimmed last week. Excessive barking, Ryder doesn't bark unless he's alerting, and even unauthorized lawn ornamentation because Ryder's water bowl was on the porch. I filed every notice away, dated and documented. Then one afternoon, I caught her on camera. Ryder and I were out back when the Ring app buzzed. I checked the live feed and saw Karren on my porch. Her hand hovered over the water bowl. Then she kicked it full on, soccer booted the damn thing across the porch. She didn't know there was a second camera above the door capturing the whole thing. That night, I sent the footage to the investigator from Fair Housing. He called me back the next morning. "This just went from civil to criminal," he said. Within a week, state investigators showed up at Karren's house. I watched from my porch as a woman in a navy blazer handed her a packet of papers and said words that made Karren's face go pale: formal notice of violation and pending fines. I wasn't done yet. At the next community HOA meeting, I showed up early and sat in the front row. Karren looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. About 20 residents were there, and I waited until the open forum. I stood up. I'd like to address the illegal actions taken by our HOA president against my federally protected service animal. Karren tried to interrupt. This forum isn't for personal greed. Actually, I said, turning to the crowd, it's the perfect place. Because what she's done doesn't just affect me. If she can target someone for a medical accommodation, she can target anyone. I handed copies of the fair housing complaint to everyone in the room. I also handed out screenshots of the violation letters and a QR code to the video of her kicking Ryder's bowl. People were stunned. Someone in the back muttered, "She fined me for having a kid's bike on the lawn." Another said, "She told me I couldn't hang a flag." Karren stood up, red-faced. "This is a smear campaign." "No, Karren," I said. "It's accountability. And the state agrees." The room turned cold. She sat down. The best part? That was just the beginning. 3 days after the HOA meeting, a notice appeared on the community bulletin board by the mailboxes. Printed in oversized font and trimmed with a red border, it read, "Emergency HOA Special Session Board Restructuring Consideration." That was Karren's handwriting, no doubt. She'd even underlined emergency twice. Like we were about to get hit by a hurricane. Not a vote. She called the meeting for a Saturday afternoon, probably hoping working folks would be too busy to show up. She miscalculated. By the time I walked over with Ryder, more than 40 residents were already seated on folding chairs in the clubhouse, murmuring amongst themselves. Several people nodded at me as I entered, a few even clapped quietly. I didn't need the validation, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. Karren stood near the front with 2 other board members, blocking access to the podium with a folding table. Her usual stiff posture was even more rigid, and her eyes kept darting toward a man in a navy suit near the back. I recognized him from the Fair Housing Authority. He'd introduced himself as Senior Investigator Marcus Heller during our last phone call. I hadn't expected him to show up in person. I took a seat near the middle, close enough to hear but far enough to watch the whole room. Ryder lay at my feet, calm and alert, and nobody seemed to mind, not even the older couple who used to avoid sitting near us. Karren cleared her throat into the microphone. This special session was called due to recent disruptions in the neighborhood caused by unfounded accusations and coordinated attempts to discredit your HOA board. A few people shifted uncomfortably. A man in a yellow windbreaker muttered something under his breath and crossed his arms. "I'd like to remind everyone," Karren continued, "that the HOA is a volunteer organization. We do our best to uphold standards and maintain order. However, you abused your position," someone said loudly from the back. Heads turned toward the speaker, an older woman with a walker and a ponytail that looked like it had been freshly brushed for the occasion. Karren ignored her. "However, in light of recent hostility, we will be voting on a motion to limit public access to board meetings as well as revise the enforcement guidelines to prevent misinformation from further damaging our community." I raised my hand. Karren's mouth tightened, but she couldn't ignore me in front of a full room. "Yes, Mr. O'Connell?" "2 questions," I said, standing. 1, are you referring to my fair housing complaint as misinformation? And 2, are you planning to revise the enforcement guidelines before or after being investigated by the state? A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Karren didn't answer immediately. One of the other board members, a man in a faded golf shirt, whispered something to her. She shook her head once and stepped away from the microphone. That's when Marcus Heller stood. "I'd like to clarify something," he said calmly. "My office is currently investigating multiple Fair Housing Act violations involving this HOA. If anyone here has been fined, harassed, or penalized in a way that may involve discrimination, we encourage you to speak with us today." He held up a stack of folders and handed them to a volunteer by the door. These include instructions for submitting statements and documentation. Everything will be reviewed. Chaos broke out. People started lining up at the back to grab a folder. The man in the windbreaker leaned over and whispered about time. Karren tried to regain control. She stepped back up and raised her voice. "This is a private meeting. We are not obligated to allow state officials to hijack our agenda." Marcus didn't even blink. "You're a registered HOA, which makes your operations subject to oversight. If you'd like to appeal that status, you're free to do so with the state attorney's office." That shut her down. Not 10 minutes later, the board was quietly overruled. The motion to restrict public access failed without a single supporting vote. People started sharing stories, some even pulling out their phones and showing dated pictures or saved emails. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted. A father of 3 explained how he'd been fined for excessive noise when his kids played basketball in their driveway. A retired postal worker showed a letter she received threatening legal action for flying a Navy flag her late husband's. A young couple said they were denied application for a patio umbrella because the color wasn't harmonious. Each story added fuel to the growing fire. Marcus took notes, and so did his assistant. By the end of the session, they had over 24 written testimonies and more than 30 residents requesting individual interviews. The real blow came the following week. A subpoena was issued for HOA financial records. Turns out, Karren had been collecting fines into a separate account, one that didn't go through the HOA's official books. The treasurer, who had apparently resigned 2 months earlier, was listed as the account's only authorized signatory. Problem was, he'd moved out of state last year. I found out when 2 detectives knocked on my door one evening. "Mr. O'Connell?" one of them said. "We're investigating embezzlement and potential fraud linked to the Maple Glen HOA. We understand you filed a discrimination complaint as well. We're building a timeline," the other added. "We'd appreciate any records you've kept." I handed them my folder, letters, timestamps, video footage, and a printed copy of the state's response. One of the detectives flipped through it and nodded. "You've done half our work already." As it turned out, over $20,000 in fines had been funneled into the hidden account. Some of that money had been used for community expenses, including catered HOA meetings, new landscaping around Karren's personal residence, and even a Bluetooth speaker system installed on her back patio, all billed as pool upgrades. She was arrested 3 days later. The news spread fast. Local TV picked up the story, especially once the words discrimination, fraud, and state charges were confirmed by the district attorney. A crowd watched from their driveways as Karren was escorted out of her house in handcuffs, wearing a silk blouse and no shoes. Ryder sat beside me on the porch, calm as ever, while neighbors whispered and filmed from across the street. The interim board, made up of 3 volunteers who'd never held office before, called an emergency vote to dissolve all standing enforcement actions from the past 12 months. They also launched a review committee to audit every fine and citation issued under Karren's leadership. I was asked to serve on that committee. I said yes. The first meeting took place in the clubhouse, now cleared of its old faux plants and musty air fresheners. We sat around a long folding table with laptops, coffee mugs, and piles of paperwork. No suits, no podiums, just neighbors trying to fix what had been broken. I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted the nonsense to stop. And it did. Slowly, the neighborhood adjusted. The father with the basketball court helped repaint the community playground. The Navy widow planted flowers outside the pool entrance. The young couple with the umbrella were approved this time unanimously. As for Ryder, he became something of a local celebrity. Kids waved when we passed. Someone even printed a community hero badge and clipped it to his vest. He didn't seem to care. He was just glad we could walk in peace. One afternoon, as I was leaving for my shift, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me near the sidewalk. He was holding a leash with a tiny dog that looked like it weighed less than a box of cereal. "I heard what you did," he said. "Thanks. My sister's got a service animal too. Different neighborhood. But knowing someone stood up to that kind of garbage, it matters." I nodded, glad it helped. He hesitated. "You think she'll get jail time?" I looked down at Ryder, who was already watching the car like he was ready to go. "I don't know," I said, "but I think she finally learned what federal law actually means." And for once, that was enough. 2 weeks after Karren's arrest, Maple Glen felt like a neighborhood exhaling for the first time in years. You could see it in the way people started lingering at mailboxes, actually talking to each other instead of power walking past with their heads down. The change wasn't just in tone, it was structural. The interim HOA board had opened every meeting to the public, and for the first time, residents were invited to participate in rewriting the community charter. That's how I ended up sitting on a folding chair in the old tennis court, now converted into a temporary meeting space with rented canopies and a long line of extension cords powering laptops and a PA system. A few of us on the oversight committee were tasked with reviewing decisions made under Karren's term, especially anything involving unusual financial authorizations. We hadn't expected to uncover what we did. Damon, said Becca, the retired paralegal who had taken over as interim treasurer, you need to see this. She slid a printed spreadsheet across the table toward me. It was a list of contractor payments, landscaping, pest control, fence repair, none of which matched actual work done in the neighborhood. The most expensive line item was a payment labeled perimeter security enhancements for over $14,000. There's no perimeter security, I said, staring at the number. Exactly, Becca said. And all those payments were issued to a company called Prescott Asset Services. Her last name, registered 3 years ago. No office, no website, just a P.O. box in Westlake. I looked up. We need to report this. Becca nodded. Already did. Turns out that was just the start. The deeper we dug, the more tangled it got. A second company, Glenwide Logistics, had received payments for delivering community newsletters, except they hadn't mailed a single one in over a year. That company, registered under the name Trevor Prescott, Karren's youngest son. It wasn't just petty fraud. It was money laundering. The district attorney's office got involved within days. Investigators returned to Maple Glen, this time with forensic accountants and a court order to seize all HOA digital records. I handed over everything: emails, scanned notices, even the timestamps from my door camera that showed when newsletters never showed up. The committee meetings doubled in size after the news broke. People came not just to listen but to volunteer. Some offered to sort boxes of old paperwork. Others brought food, coffee, even an electrician who rewired the community room so we didn't have to keep blowing fuses during Zoom calls with the DA's office. One night, right after a 5-hour session reviewing suspicious vendor payments, I stepped outside to let Ryder stretch his legs. A soft breeze moved through the trees, and for the first time since moving in, I noticed how quiet the neighborhood could be without the tension. That's when I saw Marla, one of the neighbors who used to avoid eye contact, walking toward me. She was holding a manila envelope. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, she said, but you've been fighting this from the start. So, here. I took it and opened the flap. Inside were copies of emails between Karren and someone listed only as JN. The emails discussed pressuring residents to comply and referenced reminders sent to specific homes, the same ones that had suddenly gone up for sale last year. Who's JN? I asked. Joseph Niles, she said. He was the real estate agent her niece worked for. These emails make it sound like they were forcing people out to buy up properties cheap. I read through them. The language was vague in spots but damning in others. One line stood out: if we issue 3 violations in 30 days, they'll fold. Elderly couple, no kids to fight it. I handed the envelope to Becca the next morning. She passed it directly to the assistant DA, who added it to the expanding criminal file. The charges against Karren shifted from financial misconduct to include coercion, elder abuse, and racketeering. The last one hit hard. Racketeering meant this wasn't just a case of greed, it was organized. Systematic. The news made the local paper's front page with the headline, HOA President Accused of Targeting Homeowners for Profit. Several former residents came forward after that, including a retired couple who had moved out after repeated fines and anonymous letters urging them to consider relocating for the community's good. The letters, they discovered, had been printed on HOA letterhead without board approval. The DA's office filed for a full audit of every property that had changed ownership in the past 3 years. 6 of them had been resold within 60 days of the previous owners being fined out of existence. All of them bought by buyers linked to the same 3-person realty firm: Joseph Niles, his brother, and Karren's niece. The web was unraveling fast. By midsummer, the state attorney general requested a grand jury. Karren, already out on bail, was rearrested for witness tampering after she left voicemails for 3 former board members urging them to stick to the script. This time, bail was denied. The trial was scheduled for the fall. While that storm brewed, the rest of us kept rebuilding. The new board was officially voted in, and to everyone's surprise, they asked me to run for chair. I declined. I didn't want to run anything, but I agreed to serve as a community liaison. Mostly, that meant listening, documenting, and making sure no one ever felt like they were being ignored again. One afternoon, I met with the new board in the clubhouse. It had been repainted, the old carpet replaced with clean laminate, and the windows finally opened to let sunlight in. "We're drafting a new charter," said Greg, the newly elected chair. "We want to include a clause requiring third-party audits every 2 years, and another that makes all enforcement actions require a 2-person review." "It's a good start," I said, "but you should also put in a mechanism to recall board members without needing a unanimous vote." "That's how she stayed in power." Greg nodded. "Got it." Before I left, he asked, "Do you think people will trust this place again?" I looked toward the window. A couple of kids were racing bikes down the sidewalk while their parents chatted nearby. A woman was hanging a wind chime outside her porch. No one flinched. No one looked over their shoulder. "They already do," I said. That night, I sat on my porch with Ryder. The air was warm and the streetlights flickered on one by one. Across the road, someone waved. I waved back. Ryder shifted beside me, alert but relaxed. He didn't need to watch the door anymore. No threats. No strangers. Just the hum of a neighborhood finally finding its rhythm again. And somewhere downtown, a former HOA president sat behind bars waiting for a trial that would make sure she never held power again. Justice hadn't just visited Maple Glen. It had moved in. By early October, the leaves in Maple Glen were starting to turn, but the real transformation had already happened. The neighborhood had gone from a place where people tiptoed around each other to one where residents waved, talked, and, more importantly, watched out for one another. The HOA, what was left of it, had been gutted, restructured, and was now run by people who actually lived with their windows open. But the biggest shift wasn't in policy or even leadership. It was in what people were willing to speak up about. One afternoon, I was reviewing updated community guidelines at the clubhouse when a woman named Veronica approached me. We'd never spoken before, but I'd seen her around. She lived in one of the houses on the far end of the loop near the retention pond. She held a small envelope in her hand, the kind you'd use for birthday cards. "I wasn't sure if this mattered," she said, placing it on the table in front of me. "But I found this wedged behind my circuit box when I had electricians over last week. I think." "Well, just read it." Inside was a folded letterhead from the old HOA. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. A typed memo referring to non-compliant residents, and a list of addresses next to phrases like "pressure via citations" and "escalate with property liens if unresponsive." Her address was second from the top. I looked at her. She looked tired, like someone who'd spent years second-guessing themselves and only recently realized they'd been right all along. "You ever get liens filed against you?" I asked. "No, but I was fined 6 times in 2 months. For things like leaving my porch light on past midnight. For not moving my trash bin before sunrise." I didn't respond right away. I just scanned the list again. 5 of the homes had already been reviewed by the audit committee, but 3 hadn't. 2 of them were empty now, houses that had sold in quick succession after their previous owners left with barely a word. I handed the memo to the assistant DA the next morning. She narrowed her eyes as she read it. "This isn't just procedural abuse," she said. "This is targeted coercion. We can add this to the criminal complaint under civil rights violations." I asked her what kind of sentence that carried. She didn't hesitate. "If the jury agrees it was systemic and malicious, up to 15 years. The trial was set for November. The courtroom was quiet when I walked in polished floors, high ceilings, a cold formality that seemed to swallow sound. Karren sat at the defense table in a slate gray suit, her hair pulled back tight. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. Her attorney sat beside her, flipping through a binder full of damage control. The prosecution began with the financial records, the fabricated vendor payments, the shell companies, the rerouted fines. But the real weight shifted when they introduced the testimony from residents who had been manipulated, fined into submission, or driven out entirely. Veronica testified. So did the Navy widow. So did a soft-spoken man who had taken his autistic son to speech therapy every Thursday, only to be fined for excessive vehicle use, a made-up infraction that had cost him over $900 before he moved out. Then it was my turn. I walked up, straight-spined and calm. Ryder wasn't with me, court rules, but I carried a laminated copy of his service certification in my jacket pocket, just in case. The prosecutor asked me about the letters, the threats. the citations, and finally, about the video footage, the one that had shown Karren kicking Ryder's water bowl across my porch. The defense objected. The judge overruled. When the video played for the jury, a kind of stunned silence filled the room. Not because of the act itself, but because of what it represented, contempt. Not just for me, but for the law. For the people she was supposed to serve. Did Ms. Prescott ever provide justification for her actions? The prosecutor asked. She said federal law didn't override HOA policy, I said. And is that accurate? No. It's the other way around. The defense tried to paint it as a misunderstanding. Said she was overworked, misinformed, that the board had operated under outdated policies, and that the misuse of funds had been accidental. But that argument collapsed when the emails surfaced, the ones referencing forced sales, targeted fines, and instructions to apply pressure until they fold. The jury listened to each one read aloud, and by the time the prosecutor rested, you could feel the outcome hanging in the air like a verdict already delivered. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Guilty. On all counts. The sentencing came the following week. Karren stood, silent, as the judge listed the charges: financial fraud, abuse of authority, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to defraud residents through coercive enforcement. She was sentenced to 13 years in state prison. No parole for the first 7. When the judge banged the gavel, she finally turned to look at me. Her expression wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Like she still couldn't understand how her clipboard and her title hadn't protected her. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just stood there, steady, as she was led out through the side door with her wrists cuffed behind her back. Afterward, the assistant DA approached me in the hallway. She was holding a folder thick with documents. "This case is going to set precedent," she said. "We're already drafting a bill at the state level. It's going to require all HOAs to register enforcement actions with the Department of Housing for review. No more shadow fines. No more unchecked power." Later that week, the neighborhood held a small gathering, not a celebration, exactly, but something close. People brought folding chairs and crock pots. Someone set up a projector and showed a movie on the wall of the clubhouse. Kids ran barefoot through the grass. No one handed out forms. No one measured fence height or lawn length. Greg, who had stepped down after the elections but still helped with community projects, came over and handed me a small plaque. It was wooden, handmade, with my name etched along the bottom. Above it, a quote was burned into the grain. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." I ran my fingers over the words. "You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to stand up either," he said. "But you did. And it changed everything." Ryder lay nearby, tail flicking slowly as he watched a group of kids toss a frisbee. One of them ran over and offered him a treat. He took it gently, then leaned against my leg like he knew the fight was finally finished. Not long after, I got a letter from the Attorney General's office. They were inviting me to speak at a housing reform summit in the spring. I wasn't sure I wanted to. I wasn't a politician. I wasn't an activist. I was just a guy who worked long shifts and came home to a dog who could sense when something was about to go wrong. But I said yes. Not for me. For the people who never got to speak. For the ones who moved away quietly. For every person who had ever looked at a letter taped to their door and wondered if they were the problem. Maple Glen was no longer a place ruled by fear. It was a neighborhood again. A real one. And the clipboard tyrants? They'd learned that power, when misused, doesn't just slip away. It gets taken back.